The day they sold the Callahan farm, the sky was the color of a fresh bruise. It was late October 1969. The corn was in, the beans were out, and the air had that sharp metallic bite that promises a hard winter. I stood there, 22 years old, with hands that felt useless hanging at my sides. My father had been in the ground for 6 months, taken by a heart that had worked too hard for too long, leaving behind a stack of promissory notes at the Blackwood Creek Bank that stood taller than he did. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Miller with a sweat-stained Stetson, was working the crowd like a preacher. His voice, amplified by a crackling horn speaker mounted on his truck, echoed across the empty barnyard. "All right, folks, let's move on to the real prize, the heart of this operation, 160 acres of the finest black dirt in the county. Who'll start the bidding? Who'll give me 300 an acre?" My gut twisted. 300. Dad had paid nearly 400 for the last 40 acres just 5 years ago, convinced land would never be cheaper. That was the loan that broke him. Hands shot up. The bidding was brisk. Local farmers, neighbors I'd known my whole life, were picking over the bones of our family's legacy. But one man stood apart, Richard Sterling. His family had always had money, but Rich was different. He wasn't a farmer in the way my dad was. He was an agriculturalist, he called it. He'd gone to college, learned about leverage and depreciation schedules. He stood there in a clean work shirt, hands on his hips, a smirk playing on his lips. He didn't raise his hand. He'd just nod, a quick, arrogant jerk of his chin, each time raising the bid by $1,000. He was crushing the hope out of the smaller operators. The bidding stalled at $450 an acre. Miller tried to work his magic, but the well was dry. He looked at Sterling. Sterling just gave that little nod again. 460. Sold. Miller's gavel cracked like a rifle shot. To Mr. Richard Sterling for 160 acres. A polite, almost funereal applause rippled through the crowd. Sterling walked over to the banker, a man I'd known since I was in diapers, and shook his hand, signing the papers on the hood of the banker's Buick. He owned it all now. My home. The fields where I'd learned to drive a tractor. The barn where my grandfather had milked his first cows. As the crowd dispersed, Sterling sauntered over to me. He was driving a brand-new Ford F-250, high-gloss red and chrome. My own truck was a '58 Chevy Apache, faded green with a rust hole in the passenger door you could put your fist through. "Tough break, Callahan," he said, though his eyes held no sympathy. "Your old man was a good farmer, but he was stuck in the past. You can't make money with old iron." He gestured toward the machinery lineup that had just been sold off for pennies on the dollar. Our John Deere 720, the 2-cylinder Johnny Popper that had been the pride of the farm. The old International Combine with the canvas platform. All gone. "I'm bringing in a new John Deere 4620 next spring," he boasted. 135-horse, air-conditioned cab, stereo. That's how you farm in the modern age. You got to use the bank's money to make money. I just stared at the gravel, my jaw tight enough to crack a tooth. He chuckled. "Tell you what, I'll be needing a hand next season. You know this land better than anyone. I'll pay you a decent wage, $3 an hour." The offer was both an insult and a lifeline, and he knew it. He wanted me to work as a hired man on my own family's land. He wanted to own me, too. "I'll think about it," I mumbled, the words tasting like ash. "Don't think too long," he said, turning to leave. Then he stopped and pointed toward the overgrown grove behind the machine shed. "What's the story with that old relic back there? The bank didn't even list it on the sale bill." I followed his gaze. Half swallowed by weeds and sumac trees was the hulking silhouette of my grandfather's bulldozer. A 1955 Caterpillar D6. It hadn't run in at least 10 years. The paint was gone, replaced by a deep scaly rust. The tracks were sunk 6 inches into the mud. A bird had built a nest in the exhaust pipe. "That was Grandpa's," I said quietly. "Dad never had much use for it after the terraces were built." "It's a piece of junk," Sterling scoffed. "Probably seized up solid. I'll have the scrap man haul it away next week. Might get $50 for it." Something inside me snapped. It was the one thing he hadn't taken, the one piece of Callahan steel left on this ground. "No," I said, my voice louder than I intended. It's not part of the property sale. It was my grandfather's personal machine. It's mine. Sterling raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. Yours? What in God's name are you going to do with a 10-ton paperweight, Callahan? I'm going to get it running, I said, the words coming out before I'd even fully formed the thought. He let out a loud, barking laugh. You and what army? That thing needs a complete overhaul. You've got no shop, no tools to speak of, and I'm guessing no money. Face it, it's over. The past is the past. He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture of false pity. My offer stands, $3 an hour. Think about it. He got in his new truck, the engine turning over with a quiet, powerful hum, and drove away, leaving me alone in a cloud of dust and the ruins of my life. I stood there for a long time, the auctioneer's voice still echoing in my head. Then I turned and walked toward the grove. The weeds pulled at my jeans as I pushed through to the old Dozer. I put my hand on the cold, rough steel of the blade. It was pitted with rust, but it was solid. This machine had carved the shape of our farm out of the rolling Iowa hills. It had cleared trees, filled gullies, and built the long, winding terraces that kept our topsoil from washing into Blackwood Creek. It was a monument to a different way of doing things. My grandfather bought it with cash after 3 straight years of good crops. He never borrowed a dime for equipment. If you can't pay for it, you can't afford it, he used to say. My dad had forgotten that lesson. Sterling had never even learned it. I climbed up onto the track, the steel plates groaning under my weight. The seat was cracked, the stuffing spilling out like dried guts. The controls were 2 long, stiff levers for the steering clutches and a shorter, thicker one for the main clutch. The throttle was a simple rod. There was no key. You started this beast with another engine, a little 2-cylinder gasoline motor they called a pony motor. It was raw, mechanical, and honest. Nothing on it was hidden behind plastic or wires. It was all steel, grease, and diesel. Looking out from that high seat, over the rusted hood and the massive blade, I could see the whole farm laid out before me. Sterling's farm now. A cold fury, clean and hard as a diamond, began to form in my chest. He was wrong. Everyone was wrong. This wasn't a paperweight. It wasn't junk. It was a foundation. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of bringing this old beast back to life, the weeks of busted knuckles and greasy rags, I gotta ask you folks something. Have you ever had a machine, a truck, a tool that everybody else called junk? But you knew. You just knew. It had good steel in it. The kind of thing you just couldn't let go to the scrapyard. Let me know down in the comments what that piece of iron was for you and the story behind it. I'd sure like to hear it. My first problem was getting the Dozer off the property. I had until the end of the week before Sterling officially took possession. I had a few $100s to my name, saved from summer work. I spent most of it on a man from the next town over with a lowboy trailer and a winch truck. He showed up on a Thursday morning, a grizzled old-timer named Gus, who looked at the D6 with a professional's eye. She's dug in deep, he grunted, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. We'll have to drag her out sideways before we can even think about getting her on the trailer. The whole day was a battle of steel and mud. Gus's winch strained, the cable humming with tension as it slowly, inch by painful inch, dragged the Dozer out of its decade-long slumber. The ground groaned in protest. Finally, it was on solid ground, and the slow, careful process of loading it onto the trailer began. As we were chaining it down, Sterling drove by in his shiny Ford. He slowed down, rolled down his window, and just shook his head with that infuriating smirk before driving on. He didn't have to say a word. I had arranged to rent a small, dilapidated corner of an old machine shed from a retired farmer named Henry Miller. No relation to the auctioneer. He lived on a back road a few miles out of town. The rent was $20 a month, a sum that felt monumental to me at the time. The shed had a dirt floor, a leaky roof, and one bare light bulb hanging from a cord. But it was a space to work. It was a start. For the next 6 months, that shed was my entire world. I got a part-time job pumping gas and checking oil at the local service station, working from 4 in the afternoon until 10 at night. Every morning, from sunup until it was time to leave for work, I was at the shed with the D6. The first order of business was the engine. Not the big diesel, but the little pony motor. Without it, the main engine was just a lump of iron. I drained the sludgy, water-filled oil, I pulled the gas tank and spent a day cleaning out a decade's worth of rust and varnish. The carburetor was a mess, the float stuck, the jets clogged with a green crust. I took it apart piece by piece on a clean rag on the workbench, soaking the parts in kerosene and scrubbing them with a wire brush until the brass gleamed again. The magneto, the part that created the spark, was dead. I took it to an old man on the edge of town who specialized in rebuilding magnetos for tractors. He charged me $15, nearly a full week's wages. When I got it back, I set the points and cranked the flywheel by hand. A fat blue spark jumped across the new spark plug gap. It was the first sign of life. Every step was a fight. Bolts were rusted solid. I'd soak them in penetrating oil for days, heat them with a propane torch until they glowed cherry red, and then lean on a 4-foot breaker bar with all my weight, praying the bolt would turn before the head snapped off. My knuckles were perpetually scraped, my fingernails permanently black with grease. I lived on coffee, sandwiches I made in the morning, and sheer stubborn will. The guys at the service station thought I was crazy. "Why are you wasting your time on that old junker, Jack?" one of them asked. "You could get a loan, buy a decent backhoe." "I'm not interested in loans," I'd say, and they'd just shake their heads. The talk around town wasn't kind. I was Junkyard Jack, the Callahan boy who lost the farm and was now trying to build a future out of a rust pile. I'd hear the whispers when I went to the diner for a cup of coffee. I saw the pitying looks. Sterling, meanwhile, was the town's golden boy. He'd had a great first year on my old farm. Corn prices were starting to creep up. He was already talking about tiling the South 40 and buying the 80 acres next to him. One cold morning in March, after months of work, the pony motor was ready. I filled its little tank with fresh gasoline, checked the oil, and pulled the choke. I wrapped the rope around the flywheel and gave it a pull. Nothing. I pulled again, harder. A cough, a sputter of white smoke. I pulled a third time, putting my back into it, and the little engine roared to life, a loud, angry pop, pop, pop that filled the small shed with noise and smoke. I let it warm up, a grin spreading across my face so wide it made my cheeks hurt. It was the first victory, and it tasted sweet. Now for the main event. I engaged the pinion gear that connected the pony motor to the massive flywheel of the 6-cylinder diesel. I opened the compression releases on the big engine to let it turn over easily. The shed filled with the rhythmic whirring of the giant engine spinning, oil pressure slowly building on the gauge. After a few minutes, I closed the compression releases. The pony motor strained, its happy popping turning into a deep-throated growl. I pulled the throttle on the diesel to full. The engine turned slower now, fighting against the immense compression in its cylinders. Chug, chug, chug. "Come on, you old devil," I whispered. "Come on." A puff of white smoke came from the exhaust stack. Then another, then a cloud of black smoke erupted with a deafening roar as the number 1 cylinder fired, then another and another, until the entire shed was vibrating with the thunder of the D6's diesel engine. It wasn't a smooth sound, like Sterling's new tractors. It was a deep, guttural, earth-shaking rumble, a sound of pure, raw power that had been silent for a decade. I stood there, covered in grease, shivering in the cold morning air, and just listened. It was the most beautiful sound in the world, the scorn of the town, the pitying looks, Sterling's smug face. It all melted away in the heat and roar of that engine. I had brought it back from the dead. Old iron was alive. Getting the engine running was one thing, making the dozer work was another. The steering clutches were frozen solid from years of sitting in the damp. That meant splitting the machine in half, right behind the operator's seat. It was a job that should have been done with a gantry crane in a proper shop. I had a set of heavy-duty jack stands and a chain hoist rigged up to a ceiling beam that creaked ominously under the strain. It took me a month of evenings and weekends to pull the final drives and get to the clutch packs. They were a mess of rusted steel plates fused together. I had to hammer them apart one by one. I found a supplier in Des Moines who still carried parts for old cats. The new clutch discs and plates cost me nearly everything I had left, but there was no other way. Slowly, painstakingly, I reassembled the whole rear end, torquing the bolts to spec, my muscles aching with a satisfying burn. My first paying job came in the late spring of 1970. An old farmer named Peterson, who lived on a hilly piece of ground south of town, had a fence row so thick with hedge trees and rocks, it was impassable. He'd known my grandfather and respected the old ways. "Heard you got your grandpa's old cat running," he said to me at the co-op one day. "The big outfits want a fortune to clear that fence row for me. What would you charge?" "I'll do it for $5 an hour, plus fuel," I said. He looked at me, his eyes squinting. "That's cheap, son. Too cheap." "It's my first job," I admitted. "I need to prove the machine and myself." He nodded slowly. "All right, Jack. Be at my place Monday morning." That Monday, I drove the D6 the 5 miles to Peterson's farm. It was a slow, rattling journey on the shoulder of the road, the steel tracks clanking on the gravel. When I got to that fence row, I saw what he meant. It was a tangled mess of Osage orange, boulders, and 30 years of neglect. I pushed the throttle forward. The engine's rumble deepened to a roar. I lowered the massive blade and eased the machine into the tree line. The first impact shuddered through the frame. A small tree splintered and fell. I backed up, took another run. This time a bigger tree groaned, its roots tearing from the soil. For 3 days, from sunup to sundown, I worked that fence row. The dozer was relentless. I pushed out rocks the size of washing machines, uprooted trees with trunks a foot thick, and graded the torn-up earth into a smooth, wide lane. The work was brutal. The old cat had no suspension to speak of. Every rock and jolt was transferred directly to my spine. The open operator's station left me exposed to the sun, the dust, and the swarms of insects. The noise was deafening, but at the end of each day, when I looked back at the progress I'd made, a feeling of deep satisfaction settled in me. I wasn't just clearing a fence row, I was building something. When I was done, Mr. Peterson came out and walked the length of the new lane, his head shaking in amazement. He handed me a wad of cash. "You did a damn fine job, son. Your grandfather would be proud." That $60 felt better than any money I'd ever earned. Word of mouth is a powerful thing in a small town. Soon other jobs started trickling in. Digging a pond for a cattleman, clearing a building site for a new hog confinement, building terraces for a farmer who was tired of watching his soil wash away. I wasn't getting rich, but I was paying my bills, buying fuel and parts, and slowly, very slowly, putting a little money aside. I bought a used flatbed truck, a beat-up '62 International Lodestar, paying cash for it. Now I could haul the dozer instead of driving it everywhere. I bought a better set of tools and a Lincoln stick welder. Every dollar I earned went right back into the business. I owned everything outright. No loans, no payments, no bankers. The early 1970s arrived, and with them a change in the air. In 1972, the Soviet Union, facing a disastrous harvest, secretly bought up a massive amount of American grain. The deal, which became known as the Great Grain Robbery, sent commodity prices through the roof overnight. Corn went from $1 a bushel to $3. Soybeans doubled. Suddenly, every farmer in Blackwood Creek felt like a king. The banks, flush with cash, were practically giving money away. Fence row to fence row became the mantra. Old pastures were plowed under, small woodlots were cleared, and land prices exploded. Ground that had sold for $500 an acre was now fetching $1,500, then $2,000. Richard Sterling was at the forefront of the boom. He used his newly valuable land as collateral to borrow staggering amounts of money. He bought another 200 acres at the top of the market. His fleet of machinery grew, a new International 1466 tractor, its dual rear wheels towering over a man, a gleam of red paint and chrome that could be seen from a mile away. A brand new Gleaner L2 combined with a 20-foot grain head. He built massive grain bins to store his crop, hoping to sell at the market's peak. At the diner, he was treated like a genius. "Rich Sterling, he's got the Midas touch," they'd say. "He's not afraid to take a risk. That's how you get ahead." Meanwhile, I kept working with old iron. The boom was good for me too. More farmers had cash to spend on projects they'd been putting off. I was busy from the spring thaw to the winter freeze-up. But I didn't change my ways. I still lived in a small rented room above the hardware store. I still drove my old Chevy. I saw the frenzy around me, the easy credit, the feverish buying, and it made me uneasy. It reminded me too much of my father, betting everything on the idea that the good times would last forever. One afternoon, I was at the co-op getting a barrel of diesel fuel when Sterling pulled in. He was driving a new Lincoln Continental. He got out and looked at my rig, the old International truck with my D6 chained down on the back, both machines clean but showing the scars of hard work. "Still playing with your grandpa's toys, Callahan?" he said, a familiar condescending tone in his voice. "It pays the bills," I said flatly. "Pays the bills." He laughed. "Jack, look around you. There's a fortune being made out there. I cleared more last year than your dad made in his whole life. You're sitting on the sidelines, tinkering with that junk pile, while the rest of us are building empires. Your empire is built on the bank's money, Rich," I said, looking him straight in the eye. "My junk pile is built on mine." His smile tightened. "That's loser talk. Scared money don't make money. You're just like your old man, too afraid to play the game. You'll be a small-time dirt mover for the rest of your life, and when you die, you'll have nothing to show for it but a rusty bulldozer." He turned and walked into the co-op office, leaving me standing there by my truck, his words hanging in the air. For a moment, doubt crept in. Was he right? Was I a fool, too haunted by the past to see the opportunity in front of me? All around me, my peers were buying land, building new houses, taking vacations. I was working 12-hour days, eating canned stew for dinner, and saving every penny. The whole world was telling me I was wrong. That evening, I sat in my small room, looking over my simple ledger book. On one side, income. On the other, expenses. At the bottom of the page was a small but growing number. My net worth. It wasn't much compared to the paper fortunes being thrown around town, but it was real. It was solid. It was mine. I thought about my grandfather, a man who survived the Great Depression. He believed in hard assets, not paper promises. He believed in the feel of steel, the heft of a tool in his hand, the ownership of something that couldn't vanish overnight because a number changed on a board in Chicago or New York. As the 70s wore on, the boom continued. Inflation, once a slow creep, became a gallop. The price of everything went up: fuel, parts, land, food. To combat it, the Federal Reserve started talking about raising interest rates. I'd listen to the reports on the radio at night, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. The farmers I knew just laughed it off. Their land was appreciating faster than the inflation rate. What did a few points on an interest rate matter when you were getting rich just by waking up in the morning? One day in the late summer of '78, I was finishing up a terracing job on a farm that bordered Sterling's property. It was late, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the valley. I shut down the dozer, the sudden silence ringing in my ears. Across the fence I could see Sterling's operation. Floodlights illuminated his massive machine shed and grain bins. His new four-wheel drive Steiger tractor, a monstrous green machine, sat parked, looking like something from another planet. It was an impressive sight, a testament to modern, leveraged agriculture. It looked powerful, permanent, invincible. But as I stood there in the fading light, leaning against the warm steel of my old D6, I felt a cold wind blow up from the creek bottom. It was a wind that carried no scent of rain or crops, but something else, something sharp and unsettling. It was the wind of change. A storm was coming, a financial hurricane born in faraway cities, and it was heading right for the heartland. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that most of the people celebrating in the valley below had no idea they had built their beautiful shining houses right in its path. The first sign of the coming storm wasn't thunder or lightning, but a whisper on the radio in the summer of 1979. A man with a calm voice from Washington, D.C., was appointed to run the Federal Reserve, and he spoke of monetary discipline and taming inflation. To most folks in Blackwood Creek, it was just noise, politics from a world away. They were too busy watching soybean prices climb, too busy calculating the equity in their ever more valuable land. The whispers grew louder. That winter, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, and in response, President Carter announced a grain embargo. Just like that, the biggest customer for American corn and beans was gone. The market, which had seemed like a bottomless well of prosperity, suddenly had a plug put in it. Prices didn't just fall, they plummeted. The numbers on the board at the co-op dropped day after day, erasing fortunes on paper as surely as if a fire had swept through a bank vault. Richard Sterling, who had built his empire on the assumption of ever-rising prices, was caught. He had bins full of the previous year's harvest, holding out for a price that would never come. Now he was forced to sell into a falling market just to make the interest payments on the loans he'd taken out to build those very bins. The first cracks appeared not in his machinery, but in his face. I saw him at the gas station one afternoon, filling up his Lincoln. The confident smirk was gone, replaced by a tight, worried line. He looked older, his eyes darting around as if looking for an enemy he couldn't see. He nodded curtly at me, no condescending joke, no boast about his latest purchase. He was just a man watching the numbers turn against him. That spring, the bank's attitude began to change. The easy credit dried up. Loan officers who had been whining and dining farmers a year earlier were now scrutinizing balance sheets and asking for updated collateral valuations. The phrase variable interest rate, once a tool for expansion, became a curse whispered in the diner. The real trouble for Sterling started with his machinery. His flagship tractor, the massive Steiger Panther, the pride of his fleet, went down in the middle of spring tillage. It wasn't a simple mechanical failure I could have fixed with a wrench and a pry bar. It was a complex hydraulic pump in the articulated steering system. The local dealer didn't have the part, nor the specialized tools to install it. They had to order it from the factory in Fargo, and the mechanic who knew how to work on it was booked solid for 2 weeks. Sterling's new ploughed field sat half-finished for 10 days, the exposed black dirt drying to a concrete-like crust under a relentless spring sun. He lost the perfect window for planting corn. I drove past it every day on my way to a job. My old International truck rattling along, the D6 solid on the back. I saw Sterling out there once, standing by his crippled green monster, his hands on his hips, staring at the silent machine as if he could will it back to life. He had spent $250,000 on the best equipment money could buy, and it was all useless, waiting on a single $1,000 part and a specialist from 100 miles away. In that moment, he was more helpless than I had ever been with my collection of old iron. The final blow from nature came in the summer of 1983. The rain simply stopped. The sky turned a hazy, bleached-out white and stayed that way for weeks. Corn leaves curled up tight like cigars by mid-morning, trying to conserve what little moisture they had. The ponds I had dug for cattlemen dried up, the clay bottoms cracking into patterns like giant turtle shells. The whole state of Iowa baked. My work slowed to a crawl. The ground was too hard to dig efficiently, and besides, no one had the money for new projects. But I was all right. My overhead was a leaky roof and a light bulb. I had no payments to make. I spent the summer in my shed, tearing down the D6's undercarriage, painstakingly rebuilding the rollers and replacing the worn track pins and bushings. It was preventative maintenance, an investment of time, not borrowed money. For men like Sterling, the drought was a catastrophe. His crops, planted late and stressed from the start, withered in the fields. The yields were a disaster. He had borrowed money against a projected harvest of 150 bushels per acre, and he was lucky if he got 60. It wasn't enough to cover the cost of his fertilizer, let alone the sky-high interest on his loans. The empire of leverage was beginning to collapse under its own weight. The wave crested and broke in the winter of 1984. The Federal Reserve, in its war on inflation, had pushed the prime interest rate to an unthinkable 21%. Variable rate operating loans, which farmers had signed when the rate was 8%, were now a financial guillotine, chopping away at their equity with every passing month. The farm crisis was no longer a whisper on the radio, it was a full-blown hurricane tearing through the heartland. The front page of the Blackwood Creek Sentinel became an obituary for family farms. The legal notices section was filled with foreclosure announcements and auction bills. The sale bills were all the same. As we have decided to discontinue our farming operation, it was a polite fiction. Nobody was deciding to quit. They were being forced out, broken by a combination of bad weather, bad markets, and crushing debt. The auction of the Richard Sterling farm was scheduled for a bitter cold Saturday in March. The sky was the color of lead, spitting a fine, hard sleet. It was a mirror image of my own family's auction 15 years earlier, only bigger and more tragic. The crowd was somber, not with the bargain-hunting excitement of the boom years, but with a funereal quiet. These were neighbors and friends watching a man's life being dismantled, piece by piece, knowing it could just as easily be them next week. I stood at the back of the crowd, my collar turned up against the wind. I wasn't there to gloat. I felt a profound sadness. Sterling had been arrogant and smug, but he was also a believer. He believed in the new way, in progress, in the gospel of borrowing your way to wealth. He had played the game by the rules everyone was promoting, and the rules had changed on him in the middle of the fourth quarter. The auctioneer, a younger man than the one who had sold our place, started with the machinery. The big Steiger tractor, which had cost Sterling a fortune, sold for less than 30 cents on the dollar to a syndicate of out-of-state buyers. The Gleaner combine, his pride and joy, went for scrap prices. The tools, the welders, the air compressors, everything was sacrificed. I saw Sterling standing by the side of his house next to his wife, who was weeping silently. He was a ghost. The color was gone from his face, his shoulders slumped in a way I never thought possible. His expensive work coat looked too big for him. When the auctioneer moved to the land, he couldn't watch. He turned and went inside. The land, my father's land. The banker, looking grim, stepped up next to the auctioneer. The bidding was sluggish, pathetic. No one had any money. No bank was lending. An opening bid of $1,000 an acre was met with silence. The banker tried to talk it up, speaking of the rich soil and the good location, but his words were hollow. The crowd just stared at their boots. The land, which had been valued at over $3,000 an acre just a few years before, received no serious bids. The bank was forced to buy it back itself, taking a catastrophic loss. The auction ended. The crowd dispersed quickly, eager to get away from the smell of failure. I walked over to my old Chevy Apache, the same truck I'd had all those years, its green paint now almost entirely faded to a primer grey. As I was about to get in, I saw Sterling come out of the house. He was carrying a cardboard box with a few personal items. Our eyes met across the muddy yard. I got out of my truck and walked over to him. He looked up, his eyes empty. "Tough break, Sterling," I said, the words his own, but my tone was different. There was no mockery in it. He gave a short, bitter laugh that turned into a cough. "Looks like you were right, Callahan. Scared money. It stays money, I guess." "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. "Yeah," he said, looking around at the empty spaces where his machines used to sit. "What are you going to do now?" "Got a job clearing a mile of creek bed over in the next county," I said. "It's a mess. Log jams, silted in. It's a big job." I paused. Too big for one man, really. I could use a hand, someone who knows how to run equipment. I can pay $5 an hour. He stared at me, his jaw working. He understood the offer. It was charity, but it was wrapped in the dignity of work. It was a lifeline, just like the one he had once offered me, but without the poison of contempt. I don't know," he stammered. "Think about it," I said, getting back in my truck. "The past is the past." The following Monday morning, 2 days after the auction, a man named Henderson, the president of the Blackwood Creek Bank, called me. He was the same man who had shaken Sterling's hand on the hood of his Buick 15 years ago. His voice was different now, tired and thin. "Jack," he said, "I need to talk to you. Can you come by the bank?" I went that afternoon. He led me into his office, the same office where my father had signed his last fatal loan papers. The mood was grim. Henderson looked like he hadn't slept in a week. "We're in a tough spot, Jack," he said, getting straight to it. "The bank is holding the paper on the old Callahan place, the Sterling farm. We're overextended. We can't afford to have that much non-performing property on our books. We have to unload it." I just listened, my hands resting on my knees. "The market's dead," he continued. "We can't get a decent offer. But I've been watching you. For 15 years. While everyone else was borrowing and spending, you were working and saving. You don't owe anyone a dime, do you?" "No, sir," I said. "The Dozer, the truck, the tools, They're all mine." He nodded, looking at a folder on his desk. "We know. You've got a savings account here with a respectable balance. You're the only man in this county who's in a position to buy right now." He leaned forward, his eyes pleading. "I'll sell you the original 160 acres, your family's home place, for $700 an acre. You can put down what you have in savings and we'll carry the note on the rest. A 30-year loan, fixed rate. Today's rate." The irony was so thick I could taste it. The bank that had foreclosed on my father was now begging me to save them from the consequences of their own reckless lending. $700 an acre. A fraction of what Sterling had paid, a fraction of its peak value. It was a price from a different era. It was a price my grandfather would have called sensible. I thought about the years of work, the busted knuckles, the cold mornings, the lonely nights, the whispers and the condescending laughs. I thought of my father and my grandfather and the promise I had made to a rusted piece of steel in a weed-choked grove. "All right, Mr. Henderson," I said, my voice steady. "You've got a deal." We signed the papers right there. I wrote out a check that drained my savings account, but I didn't feel poorer. I felt a weight lift off my soul that had been there for 15 years. As I walked out of the bank and into the cold March air, I wasn't just Jack Callahan, the dirt mover. I was Jack Callahan, the farmer, the owner of the Callahan farm. The first thing I did was drive out to the place. It looked sad and neglected. The yard was rutted from the auction traffic. The house was empty. I walked out to the machine shed, the big new one Sterling had built. It was cavernous and silent. I stood in the middle of the concrete floor and let the reality of it wash over me. The next morning, I was back with my old International truck, the D6 chained to the flatbed. I unloaded it and drove it to the overgrown grove behind the shed, to the very spot where it had sat for a decade. It felt like bringing a king back to his throne. A pickup truck pulled into the driveway. It was Richard Sterling. He got out and walked over, looking older and thinner than he had just a few days ago. "I heard," he said quietly. "Congratulations." "Thanks," I said. We stood in silence for a moment. "My offer still stands," I said. "I'm going to need help getting this place back in shape. $5 an hour." He looked at the ground, then at me. There was no pride left in him, only exhaustion. "Okay, Callahan," he said. "Okay, Jack. I'll take it." And so we went to work. Together. He ran the newer John Deere 4440 tractor that the bank had thrown in with the deal, pulling a chisel plow through the compacted fields. I used the D6 to repair the terraces that had eroded from neglect and to clear the fence rows that had grown shaggy and wild. We didn't talk much about the past. We talked about the weather, about soil types, about the price of seed corn. We were just two men working the dirt, trying to bring a piece of land back to life. The town watched, amazed. The story of how Junkyard Jack had bought back his farm and hired the man who took it from him became a local legend, a parable for the hard times. The years passed. The farm crisis slowly receded. Prices stabilized. I paid down my loan aggressively, pouring every spare dollar I had into it. Sterling worked for me for 2 years, and they were 2 of the best crop years we'd ever had. He was a good farmer, a smart operator, when he wasn't blinded by ambition. He eventually saved up enough to move his family to Minnesota, where he got a job managing a large corporate farm. We shook hands the day he left, a quiet respect between us. We had both learned a hard lesson from the same unforgiving teacher. By the early 1990s, the farm was paid for in full. I had met and married a woman from town, a schoolteacher named Sarah, who understood the value of a quiet, steady life. We had a son, David. I never expanded beyond the original 160 acres. I never bought brand new, shiny equipment. I bought good, used machines. A John Deere 7720 combine, an International 1086 tractor. And I paid for them with cash. We weren't rich, but we were secure. We owned our lives. One warm summer evening, when David was about 15, I found him out in the old machine shed, looking at the D6. I kept it in perfect running order, a monument to our family's history. "Dad," he said, running his hand over the massive steel blade. "Did you really get this thing running all by yourself?" "I did," I said, standing next to him. "It was a different time." Grandpa lost the farm because he borrowed too much, right? That's right, I said. He was a good man and a good farmer, but he got caught up in the idea that the good times would never end. He forgot the most important rule. What rule is that? David asked. I put my hand on the cold, thick steel of the Dozer's track. That you should never bet something you can't afford to lose. This machine, it's not just iron and grease, it's a reminder. It reminds us that real wealth isn't about how much you can borrow. It's about what you own, free and clear. It's about building something slow and solid, something that can withstand the storm when it comes, because the storm always comes. I climbed up into the operator's seat, the worn metal familiar beneath me. I looked out over the fields of corn and soybeans shimmering in the golden light of the setting sun. My fields. My home. I reached down and cracked the compression releases on the big diesel. Want to hear her run? I asked my son. His eyes lit up. Yeah. I fired up the pony motor, its familiar pop, pop, pop echoing in the quiet shed. After a minute, I engaged the pinion and started turning the big engine over. Then I closed the releases, gave it the throttle, and with a great eruption of black smoke and a thunderous roar, old iron came to life once more. The whole shed vibrated with its deep guttural rumble. It wasn't the sound of desperation or anger anymore. It was the sound of survival. It was the steady, powerful heartbeat of the Callahan farm.